My parents tried to collect insurance money for my death while I was still alive. When I saw the first message from my old school buddy containing the phrase, "I'm truly sorry for your loss," I initially assumed it was some kind of addressing error or just a ridiculous prank, a clumsy attempt to joke at someone who clearly didn't deserve that kind of attention. After all, I hadn't lost anyone recently, at least no one significant enough for the term loss to pierce my soul like a sharp thorn, causing unbearable pain and confusion. I even replied to him asking, "Whose loss exactly?" expecting the sender to realize their mistake and clear up the misunderstanding as soon as possible, without dragging out this strange conversation. However, the response came almost immediately, and it read, "Your own, the farewell ceremony was truly touching and emotional," which made me freeze in place, because in that moment, something inside me, this small but solid and genuine sense of reality, suddenly split in two, like a fragile crystal under the blow of an invisible hammer. Because this no longer seemed like a simple mix-up or someone's stupid idea, but rather like the moment when you suddenly wake up in the middle of a nightmare, where everything around seems familiar and dear, but the laws of this world stop working by the usual rules, causing complete bewilderment and horror before the unknown. I started dialing phone numbers one after another, but no one answered my calls, which only heightened my anxiety, so I moved on to checking social networks, first peeking into Twitter, then LinkedIn. And at that moment, my heart started pounding so hard that my fingers began to tremble finally from adrenaline and fear. My personal page no longer belonged to me in the full sense of the word, because right above my name now loomed the inscription, "In loving memory of," turning the entire profile into a virtual memorial, where I was officially listed among the departed, marked with a digital stamp of death that couldn't be erased with one click. At first, I thought it was the work of some cybercriminals who decided to frame me this way or extort money. But then I noticed hundreds of comments from people from my past, where they wrote things like, "You were always such a generous and responsive person," or "Rest in peace, buddy, we'll never forget your kind deeds," as well as, "None of us could foresee such an outcome, but your memory will stay with us forever," which made me scroll through the feed further and further in search of explanations. And among all these familiar faces and messages, one image pierced me through like a sharp dagger, because it captured my parents standing next to a closed coffin, holding hands like a perfect couple from a glossy magazine, with my father, whose face looked absolutely impassive and stony, and my mother, whose eyes were red from tears. But she seemed composed, as if following a pre-prepared script, and under the photo was the caption, "We'll forever keep you in our hearts, our beloved son." I distinctly remember whispering into the silence of my empty apartment the words, "What the hell is going on here?" feeling my voice break from a mix of rage and incomprehension. And at that moment, I immediately dialed the home number. But again, no one answered, so I kept calling over and over until the answering machine started seeming like a real mocker to me, repeating the same phrase with cold monotony. When my father finally picked up, his tone was even and detached, as if he were talking to a complete stranger who had no relation to our family, and he asked, "Who's calling?" which made me freeze for a few seconds before I could force out, "Dad, it's me, your son." After a long pause, during which I heard only his breathing, he said, "This isn't funny at all, stop this nonsense," which confused me even more, so I exclaimed, "Dad, what are you even talking about? It's really me, James R. Harris. Please explain to me why everyone around thinks that I—" But he interrupted me mid-sentence, dryly and calmly, as if reading from a paper, saying, "Don't call here again under any pretext," and immediately hung up, leaving me in complete bewilderment. You know, that turned out to be the quietest, but at the same time the most terrifying episode in my life up to that point. Because when even your own father refuses to recognize your voice on the phone, then who in this world can confirm your existence as a real person, without letting you dissolve into the void of doubts and fears? That whole night I didn't close my eyes for a minute, tossing and turning in bed and going over all possible scenarios in my head, until I finally stumbled upon an announcement about the farewell ceremony on the internet, where my full name was listed, date of birth, and even a photo from the recent past, with the caption, "James R. Harris, 34 years old, beloved son, tragically departed from life as a result of an accident that no one could foresee." Only no accident had happened to me in reality, because I was sitting at my kitchen table, absolutely alive and healthy, reading my own obituary on the computer screen, feeling cold sweat running down my back from the realization of the absurdity of the situation. And at the bottom of the page, in bold font, it was printed, "In lieu of flowers, please donate to the Harris Family Fund," which suddenly revealed to me a possible motive for all this madness, making me freeze for a moment and reread the lines several times. At first, I still tried to find excuses for them, thinking that maybe someone had misused their name, created a fake page, or spread false news. But then I saw photos on the fund's website where it was them, my mother and father, standing against the background of that same stupid kitchen wallpaper with a pattern that I remembered from childhood. And at that moment it became clear that there could be no mistake here, because all the details matched perfectly, indicating that this was their handiwork. 2 days later, I set off on the road to my childhood home, feeling like I was returning to the scene of a crime where I myself was the victim who had somehow survived and was now seeking answers. The small town in Oregon, where I had spent my entire childhood and youth, suddenly seemed completely alien and hostile to me, because the people I had known all my life waved at me from afar but didn't really recognize me, seeing before them either a ghost from the past, or some illusion, or just a guy who, according to all documents, should have been lying in the ground for several weeks already. When I finally pulled up to our old house, I sat in the car for a long time, not daring to get out and face reality head-on, watching the warm light glowing in the windows, indicating that both of them were inside, these people who gave me life but now, apparently, decided to take it away for their own gain. I knocked on the door and Mom opened it, after which her face instantly paled, but not from fright, rather from the feeling of being caught red-handed. And she didn't scream, didn't rush to hug me, and didn't faint from shock, but simply said quietly, "You can't show up here, please leave as soon as possible," while her voice trembled slightly, and her eyes darted from side to side, checking if any of the neighbors had noticed my arrival. I asked her point blank, "What have you done, Mom? Why did you declare me dead and stage this whole show?" But she only whispered in response, "James, leave, I beg you shouldn't be here." To which I objected, "Leave when you've officially made me a corpse and now everyone thinks I'm in the ground. Do you even realize what consequences this has for my life and everything connected to it?" But she shushed me, "Quiet, please. You just don't understand the whole situation and its complexity." And indeed, at that moment I understood nothing. But when I glanced over her shoulder into the living room, I saw a frame on the wall with a clipping from the local newspaper, where there was my portrait and the inscription below it, "Forever in our hearts, we'll never forget you," which only intensified my confusion. From the kitchen came my father's voice, asking, "Who's there at this late hour?" But Mom didn't answer him a word, and when he came out into the hallway and saw me standing on the threshold, he showed neither surprise nor fright, but simply clenched his jaw in that same habitual manner he always displayed when he was about to say something final and not subject to discussion or objection. He said, "You need to leave here immediately and not come back," to which I replied, "I'm not moving until you explain to me in detail why you told everyone around about my death and staged these fake funerals." But he looked at me not with guilt or fear, but with cold irritation, as if I had disrupted their carefully thought-out scheme and was now creating unnecessary problems. Dad exhaled heavily, as if preparing for a long lecture on economics or ethics, and said, "We simply had no other choice in that situation when everything was heading toward complete collapse," which divided my life into two halves. Before this phrase and after it, making me stand in the doorway and try to comprehend what I had heard, while each second stretched endlessly, like molten wax dripping slowly and bringing no enlightenment. My father stood opposite me motionless, as if carved from granite, from which he always built his unshakable decisions, and Mom next to him trembled finely, muttering something under her breath, as if trying to convince herself that this whole scene was just a nightmare that would dissipate if she just squeezed her eyes shut tight and waited a bit. I struggled to find the words and said, "Do you mean you filed for my death solely to get the insurance payout to cover your debts?" To which Dad replied calmly, like an accountant summing up the financial year, "We didn't just file, we processed all the documents in full compliance with the law, and there was even a body to make everything look convincing and not raise suspicions." These words hung in the air heavily and stickily, like thick smoke after a big fire, making me exclaim, "What the hell kind of body did you use for this staging? Explain the whole truth to me without holding back." Dad slowly turned his head toward me and said, "You really don't want to know all the details? Trust me on that. It'll be better for you to remain ignorant about some aspects of this matter. But when someone tells you not to dig deeper, it only fuels curiosity and makes you dig even harder, because that's where the darkest and most rotten truth is hidden, which they're trying to conceal." I insisted, "Tell me everything as it is without omissions," and he finally threw out, it was some homeless vagrant. No one needed him, and without any documents on hand, we did everything very neatly and professionally to leave no traces. He spoke about it as if describing a routine replacement of a car part, not the substitution of a human life and fate, which caused a surge of dark fury in me, almost animal in nature, making me shout, "You took someone's body and passed it off as mine to stage a death and get money. Do you even understand how criminal and immoral that is?" Dad interrupted me sharply, saying, "We were saving our family from complete ruin since the loans were choking us monthly. The interest was piling up like a snowball, and if not for this step, nothing would have been left of us in the end, no home, no means of livelihood." To which I yelled, "And what about me? I'm alive and standing here before you, Dad. Do you realize what you've done to your own flesh and blood?" Mom at that moment started crying quietly, pressing her palms to her face, and said through tears, "We thought you'd never come back to us, James. You disappeared for months, didn't call, didn't write a line. We didn't even know if you were alive for real. And that's when this idea came to mind, seeming like the only way out of a hopeless situation," while looking at me with the eyes of a guilty child caught in a small lie, which only worsened my despair and pain. I had indeed left the town almost a year ago after that big argument, when I declared that I no longer intended to cover their endless debts from my own pocket, striving to start a new life from scratch, moving to Seattle, where I found a job and rented a modest room in the center. But at the same time, I never stopped being their son by blood, and certainly didn't cease my existence as a living person. I asked in a dull voice, "And how much did you get from this insurance scam in the end? How much is my life worth in your eyes?" To which Dad replied, "That's none of your business and shouldn't concern you." But I insisted, "Tell me the exact amount right now." And Mom quietly said, $300,000, that's all they paid us after processing the documents. That figure hit me like a punch to the gut, making me feel the ground slipping from under my feet, because $300,000, that's the price they set for my life, choosing a check over their son, which made the whole world around even more absurd and cruel. That night I didn't sleep a wink again, sitting in the car opposite their house and gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white from the strain, while a fine rain fell outside, and each drop on the windshield seemed to me like a bill for their sins, lies, and betrayal, which they committed without the slightest hesitation. I tried to find the strength in myself to understand their motives, thinking about desperation, debts, and fear of the future. But the longer I pondered it all, the clearer it became that this wasn't a spontaneous act of despair, but rather a deliberate choice in favor of money, convenience, and life without me as a burden. The next morning, I headed to the local police station, but already at the threshold, I realized that I might be making a serious mistake that could turn against me, because as soon as I said to the officer, "I'm the person who was officially declared dead a few weeks ago," he looked at me like a complete madman, not hiding the skepticism in his eyes. He asked, "Your full name and details for verification in the system." To which I replied, "James Harris," and after entering the information into the computer, he frowned and said, "According to our records, you're listed as deceased, with the corresponding certificate and all documents." So I explained, "Yes, I'm aware of that record, but it's a mistake, or rather a forgery, because I'm standing here alive, and my parents staged my death to get the insurance payout to cover their debts." The officer blinked several times and said slowly, "That's a very serious accusation against your relatives, and it requires thorough verification." To which I replied, "I understand the seriousness, but I have grounds to think so," and handed him printouts of the funeral announcement, screenshots of the memorial page on social networks, and documents from their fund, which he studied for a long time before saying, "Please have a seat. I'll call the investigator for a more detailed conversation." The investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired look of someone who had seen too many dark sides of life, listened to my story from beginning to end without a single interruption, and when I finished, he exhaled and said, "You're far from the first to come to us with similar stories about family scams and fraud." I asked, "What do you mean by that? Do such cases happen often in your area?" To which he replied, "Sometimes families do resort to forgeries with insurance to get out of a debt pit. But if the payout has already been made and the money received, it's extremely difficult to return it, especially without a body or other key evidence." So I objected. "But there was a body. They found some homeless guy, passed him off as me, and buried him under my name to make it all look plausible." He nodded and said, "Exactly, and now explain to me where that body is now and how we can confirm your version without exhumation or other procedures." And at that moment, I realized that I had no solid evidence except my own words, since all the documents, photos, and medical reports were with my parents. And officially, I remained dead, turning into a person without status, name, or rights in this world. The investigator handed me his business card and quietly added, "If you decide to see the matter through and file an official statement, you'll need reliable protection, because as soon as the insurance company learns of your existence, your parents won't just be held accountable. They'll lose everything and possibly try to stop you by any means, including those beyond the law." Those words stuck in my head like a splinter, especially the phrase, "try to stop," causing paranoia and fear, so when I left the station, for the first time in many years, I felt real horror at the thought of returning home, understanding that now every step could be dangerous. A few days later, I rented a cheap room in the suburbs of Portland and started my own investigation, contacting an acquaintance in the local morgue, where I was told that during that period, a body of a man without documents about my age, with severe burns and injuries that made identification almost impossible without a DNA test, had indeed arrived, and based on that data, the death certificate for me was issued, which seemed too convenient a coincidence. However, one detail didn't match their version of events, because the death of this man was recorded a week before I completely stopped contacting my parents, which indicated that they didn't find the body by chance, but purposefully searched for a suitable option for their scheme, planning everything in advance with cold calculation. I started recalling details from that period when I left the town after the arguments, calls from collectors, my father's rage, and my mom's pleas to give them a little more time to solve the problems. And then suddenly silence fell, they stopped calling altogether, and a month later, as I now understood, I officially died in their eyes and documents. This no longer looked like an act of desperation from hopelessness, but rather like a carefully thought-out plan, where every step was calculated for maximum benefit, ignoring moral aspects and human lives. I showed up at their place again without warning, and they clearly weren't expecting my return, because Mom opened the door, turned pale as a sheet, and whispered, "James, please don't do anything rash, just leave and forget about everything." To which I replied, "Don't do what exactly, just continue existing as if nothing happened after all you've done." Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee with a look as if nothing extraordinary was happening around, and said without lifting his eyes from the cup, "It's time for you to leave here and not come back." But I stepped forward and said, "I'm not leaving until you tell me the whole truth from beginning to end without holding back." To which he replied, "You already know enough to understand the essence. The rest won't change anything." I insisted, "No, I want to know exactly whose body is lying in the cemetery under my name and how you pulled it all off." And Mom at that moment covered her face with her hands, starting to sob quietly, while Dad was silent for a long time, and then quietly said, "It's none of your business and shouldn't concern you, just accept it as fact." I lost it and screamed, "None of my business when you buried a stranger, passing him off as me, stole someone's death to buy yourselves a house, a car, and a debt-free life. Do you understand how monstrous and criminal that is?" To which Dad yelled back, "Enough already. You have no idea what it's like to lose absolutely everything you've built over the years. We did what we had to do in that situation." I froze in place, because in his voice there wasn't a drop of guilt or remorse, only anger and contempt for me as an obstacle in their plans, which made the situation even more unbearable. Mom continued to sob, and I saw her take a small envelope from the table drawer and hand it to me with the words, "Don't open it here. Just read it when you leave and calm down." So I took it and went out the door, feeling my heart pounding at a frantic pace, as if after a marathon run, though I was just walking down the street under the evening sky. Inside the envelope was a photo of a man in his 40s with graying hair and eyes that seemed vaguely familiar to me, and on the back was the inscription, "Forgive us, it was your Uncle Richard," which made me not immediately realize the full horror of the situation. Uncle Richard, my mother's brother, about whom the family almost never spoke openly, supposedly disappeared 10 years ago, supposedly having gone abroad in search of a better life. But now it became clear that he hadn't gone anywhere, and his body was used to stage my death, making everything so that family ties by DNA would facilitate identification and processing documents without extra questions. This thought stabbed into me like a knife, slowly penetrating the chest and twisting inside, because they didn't just symbolically kill me, but used the real death of a relative to make everything look perfectly planned, with easy coincidences and quick receipt of the payout. I returned to the motel, sat on the bed, and just stared at the photo, noticing some peaceful expression in Richard's eyes as if he himself wished to leave this world, and began to wonder if he was part of this scheme willingly or not. Perhaps it was some agreement to give them a chance for salvation. Or worse, someone from them helped him leave against his will. That night, for the first time, I felt real physical fear for my life, not metaphorical or internal, but primal and animal, because I realized that if they were capable of pulling this off once, they could do it again, but this time not fake, but for real to eliminate the obstacle. I locked the door with all the locks, propped it with a chair for good measure, and sat in the dark until dawn, staring out the window and listening to every rustle, feeling my existence becoming more and more ephemeral, as if I were just a glitch in the system, a ghost among living people who continue their routine. And yet, somewhere deep in my soul, I knew I couldn't just leave and forget about everything, because I had to dig into every detail, every lie, and every hidden fact. Because if they could kill me on paper, they could do the same with him, only this time for real. I thought that this photo was the limit of everything, that it couldn't get worse. But when you peer into the abyss from which your own death crawled out, there's no way back. You either fall back into it or crawl even deeper, where the very essence of truth decomposes, covered with layers of deception and dirt. I woke up at 6 in the morning with a sticky feeling of anxiety that didn't let go for a minute, and decided that I no longer intended to wait for mercy from my parents. So if they wouldn't tell me what exactly happened to Richard, I'd find out myself, even if it meant digging through the dirt they'd been burying for years under a layer of silence. I started by visiting the municipal archive in the gray City Hall building, where the air was saturated with dust and the smell of old papers. And there I was met by an elderly woman archivist with piercing eyes, who seemed to see through all visitors. So I explained that I was looking for information about Richard Miller's disappearance in 2013, and she began flipping through thick journals, rustling the pages as if fate itself was sorting through dates and events. She froze on one page and quietly said, "Yes, such a case was indeed registered as missing without a trace, and it was closed a year after the investigation began." To which I asked, why exactly closed? Didn't they find any leads or body? And she replied, looking at me warningly, they didn't find a body, but there were rumors of oddities, like a drowned man without traces of water in the lungs or something similar, that raised questions. I asked for copies of the documents, and half an hour later I was holding a thin folder in my hands, smelling of time and secrets, with photos, protocols, and reports, where one of the shots showed Richard smiling at the camera, but with anxiety in his eyes, as if he foresaw that this was his last frame in life. The reports indicated that his last contact was recorded at my parents' house a day before the disappearance, with a witness named Robert Harris. That is, my father, which made everything even more suspicious, and indicated that this wasn't just an insurance scam, but a crime whose roots went much deeper into the past. I went to Richard's old house where he lived alone, and found it abandoned with broken windows, overgrown with weeds and dead trees around. So when I opened the door, I was immediately hit by the smell of damp dust, rust, and something rotten, but not physical, rather moral decay that had permeated the walls. I went through all the rooms one by one, noticing scraps of old newspapers on the walls with notes about banks, debts, and financial machinations, and on the table lay a tattered notebook, which I opened with a tremor in my hands. The first entry dated back to 2012, and read, Robert got into big trouble with big money and bad people. He said he'd find a way to pay off, but I hope not the way he usually chooses for such things. And further entries became increasingly gloomy and anxious, describing growing problems. One of them read, he offered me something strange, said he had a scheme with insurance, for which he only needs a person who just disappears without a trace. At first I thought it was a joke, but then I realized he was serious as never before. I read on, and my fingers trembled more from excitement, because this wasn't just a diary of everyday thoughts, but rather the confession of a man who knew in advance how it would all end for him. The last entry, made just 2 days before the disappearance, read, he said this is the last chance for all of us, that he's no longer asking but demanding my participation, and if I don't agree, he'll arrange it his own way, so if this notebook is found, it means he carried out his threat. I stood in the middle of the empty house, feeling chills down my spine, and realized that my father had killed his own brother-in-law, and then used his death to later kill me on paper, as if one death wasn't enough. and another person needed to be erased to save his own skin. I returned to the town, and on the answering machine, a message from Mom was already waiting. "James, it's me. Please don't go where you shouldn't. You don't understand the full depth of the situation. Just contact us and we'll talk, I beg you," with a tremor in her voice. But I no longer believed a single word from their mouths because it was too late for trust. I decided to meet with my father's former colleague from the bank where he worked for many years. A man named Paul, gray-haired and with shaking hands, living in an old apartment where the smell of alcohol overpowered all other aromas, including shame and regret about the past. When I mentioned the surname Harris, he looked at me like a ghost from another world and asked, "You're his son, right? The one everyone's talking about?" To which I replied, "I was once, but now everything's changed." And he poured himself a glass of whiskey, drank it in one gulp, and then said, "Robert didn't get into all this for nothing. He owed people you can't refuse without consequences." I asked, who exactly did he owe such sums that he had to go to extremes? And he replied, shuddering, "Those who erase debts along with the debtors themselves, without pity or doubt." Adding after a pause, Richard was the last one who tried to stop him from mad steps. This squeezed everything inside me into a tight knot, because now it no longer looked like a purely family tragedy with elements of despair, but rather part of a large system of debts, deaths, and fake documents, woven into a single network. I asked Paul if he knew who was behind all this in the end, and after a long silence, he pulled out an old scrap of paper with a phone number written by hand, saying, "If you need the whole truth to the end, call this number, but be prepared that they already know about your resurrection and may react accordingly." That night I sat for a long time with the phone in hand, staring at those digits, each of which seemed like a coordinate on the map of hell, full of dangers and secrets, but still dialed the number, hearing long beeps and then a cold male voice saying, "James Harris, we've been waiting for your call." I asked, "Who's speaking and how do you know my name?" To which he replied calmly, "Your father shouldn't have involved the family in his affairs. We considered the matter closed after all the events." So I exclaimed, "What the hell matter do you mean? Explain to me right now." He continued, "The very one for which he gave his brother-in-law as payment or sacrifice." To which I yelled, "What did you do to him? Confess everything." But he replied, "We didn't do anything personally. He made his own choice in that situation, but now you've become his continuation, and that complicates everything." After which there was a click and the beeps of a disconnected line. I sat with the phone in numb fingers, feeling nothing but cold inside, because they knew who I was, knew I was alive, and now this had gone beyond a family matter, becoming part of something bigger and more dangerous. When I returned to my motel room, the door was slightly ajar, though I was absolutely sure I had locked it before leaving, and inside reigned dead silence, broken only by the sight of Richard's photo lying on the bed face down. I turned it over with trembling hands and saw new words scribbled in pencil in haste. He knew about everything. And you should too. It's all in the safe, code, the date of your death on the documents, which made me immediately head back to my parents' house without delay. Mom was home alone, pale and exhausted from stress, and whispered at the sight of me, "Why did you come again? This will only make everything worse." To which I replied, "For the truth you're hiding, tell me where the safe is right now." She was silent for a long time, staring at the floor, and then quietly said in the basement behind the tool shelves, "But James, don't open it under any circumstances, I beg you. It will only bring trouble." However, I went down, found the metal box covered in dust with a mechanical code lock, and entered the date from the death certificate. July 15, 2020, hearing the click of the opening mechanism. Inside were stacks of documents, insurance policies, bank statements, copies of passports, and one flash drive, which I immediately plugged into my laptop, finding a single video file on it, which I launched without hesitation. On the screen appeared my father, sitting at that same kitchen table where we had recently talked, and he said, "If you're watching this video, it means the situation has completely gotten out of control, and I couldn't hold it all together, but know that I did what I had to do for all of us." Richard knew what he was getting into from the beginning. He signed all the papers voluntarily, but then he started doubting and threatening exposure, so I couldn't let him destroy the whole plan with one careless step. He paused, breathing heavily, as if struggling with inner demons, and continued, "You have to understand me, son. Sometimes to save the family, you have to sacrifice even close blood. Without that, everything would have collapsed completely." And after another pause added, "If you decide to go against us and the system, they'll come for you too. Don't make me regret my decisions." The screen went dark, leaving me in the basement darkness, where I felt something inside finally breaking under the weight of the truth. Because this wasn't just a chain of lies, but a whole philosophy of justifying murder, betrayal, and baseness in the name of the supposed family, which in reality no longer existed as a whole. Behind me came a quiet sound of footsteps, and when I turned around, I saw my father on the stairs with a gun in his hands, calmly saying, "You shouldn't have opened that safe. Now it's over for both of us, and there's no way back." I froze in place, noticing in his eyes not hatred or malice, but only deep fatigue, as if he was about to eliminate not me as his son, but the person I had become after uncovering the whole truth, now standing between him and his illusion of salvation. I stood in the basement, surrounded by shadows, dust, and the ghosts of my relatives, not believing my eyes that the man holding the gun on me was my father, the same one who taught me to ride a bike as a child, filmed my first steps to school, and now stood just a few feet away, looking at me with eyes where nothing human remained except fatigue and fear of exposure, ready to pull the trigger. He raised the weapon a bit higher, aiming not at the heart, but at the head, as if wanting to make it quick and without unnecessary suffering, and said in that quiet voice he always used to keep his rage inside, "You don't understand the whole picture, James. If you leave here alive, they'll come for both of us without mercy. Everything I've done over these years, I did solely so you could survive in this cruel world." I laughed bitterly and madly, with a hoarse sound in my throat, saying, "You staged my death so that I could supposedly survive, killed your own brother-in-law, forged a bunch of documents, turned my life into complete fiction, and now you call it family protection, seriously." To which he lowered his gaze, as if under the weight of my words something inside him finally broke completely, and whispered, "You shouldn't have found that safe and everything in it. It could have all ended quietly and peacefully. You would have just been forgotten over time. But you would have remained alive somewhere far away. That's all they required from us, for you to disappear from sight forever." I clenched my fists so hard that my nails dug into my palms and asked, "And what did you yourself need from all this, Dad, besides money and peace?" But he was silent for a long time, and then quietly said, "Forgiveness for all my mistakes and decisions." And those words sounded strange, as if he was addressing them not to me, but to himself, trying to convince his own conscience of the possibility of repentance after everything done. The seconds stretched endlessly, and I saw his fingers trembling on the trigger, understanding that any sudden movement could provoke a shot. But perhaps for the first time in my life, I felt that I no longer feared death after everything I'd been through, because I lived among the dead who walk, talk, and pretend to be alive, but inside have long been burned to ashes. I asked, trying to keep my voice even, what exactly happened to Richard. Tell me the truth to the end without embellishments. To which my father exhaled heavily, as if tearing a piece of his soul out of himself, and replied. He wanted to stop the whole plan and was already heading to the police with evidence, but they were paid in advance for silence. They said that without a body, the case wouldn't even be opened officially. I continued, "And you made sure there was no body in the usual sense, or how did it really happen?" And he slowly nodded, saying, "I didn't want it initially. He jumped into the water himself during the argument. I tried to pull him to shore, but it was too late. And then I realized that if blood was spilled, it shouldn't go to waste, but serve the family's salvation." He stepped closer to me, gradually lowering the gun, and added, "I did what I had to, so you wouldn't repeat my mistakes and get into the same quagmire of debts and threats." I don't know exactly what happened next. Perhaps it was pure survival instinct, or despair pushed me forward, but I lunged at him, hearing a loud shot, the echo of which hit the basement walls like thunder in an enclosed space, filled with the smell of metal, blood, dust, and ancient horror, as if the house itself exhaled the accumulated pain for us. Dad fell to the floor, dropping the weapon, but the bullet grazed his arm, not causing fatal harm, and I staggered back, hitting the wall with a dull thud, trying to catch my breath. He lay on the floor, breathing heavily and forcing out words, "You still don't understand the full depth. They're already coming for us." To which I leaned closer and asked, "Who exactly is coming? Explain to me finally." But he no longer heard anything, his eyes glazed over, staring into emptiness. Upstairs, the front door slammed dully and shortly, followed by the footsteps of several people, heavy boots and muffled voices, indicating that they had indeed come, as he had warned. I grabbed the gun, turned off the light in the basement, and hid behind the nearest cabinet, feeling my heart pounding in my temples like a hammer, not letting me concentrate. They came down, and the beam of the first flashlight slid along the wall, and a voice said, "He should be somewhere here. Check every corner thoroughly and quietly." I heard them moving boxes, dropping metal objects, and approaching my father's body, where one of them said, "-1 already, now look for the sun, he couldn't have gone far." I understood that if they found me, at best I'd die a second time, but this time finally and without the possibility of return. So on tiptoes, I moved to the back door of the basement, but the floor creaked treacherously under my foot. The flashlight beam swung toward me, and there was a shout, "Stand still, don't move." To which I responded with 2 shots into the darkness, hearing the echo tearing from the ceiling, cries of pain, and the sound of a falling body. I dashed up the stairs, feeling my feet slipping on pools of blood, and in the kitchen jumped out through the broken window outside, where the cold night air hit my face refreshingly and sharply, giving me strength to run further. Behind me thundered the footsteps of pursuers, but I raced through the garden and wet grass until I burst onto the road, and the night was so deaf and dark that only in the distance flashed the headlights of passing cars, giving hope for salvation. I reached the old bridge on the outskirts of the town and hid under one of the spans, sitting there and shivering from the cold, clutching the gun in my hands, trying to realize that everything I knew about my family turned out to be a complete lie, where they buried me for money, killed my uncle to pay off a debt, and my father, who seemed a monster, in the end tried to save me from something much larger and more dangerous. I turned on the laptop, making sure the flash drive was still with me, and found on it a second file named Legacy, which I opened without delay, seeing a document with contacts, account numbers, names, and details. It turned out to be a whole network of dozens of people connected to my father: businessmen, officials, insurance agents, and lawyers, all of them participating in schemes of fake deaths, disappearances, and fictitious payouts. And next to it lay a copy of my real passport with the note "active since 2020, control subject for test scenarios." Then I realized that I wasn't just a random victim of a family scam, but part of a larger experiment, where my death was used as a template for working out new methods of insurance fraud, and my father became just a pawn who paid for everything with his blood and life. I didn't know how much time I had left before they found me, but I firmly understood one thing: if I disappeared again, this time no one would believe in my death, because now I had real evidence on the flash drive capable of exposing the entire network. In the morning, I left the town forever, changed my name to a fictional one, bought a used car, and drove without a specific direction until I ended up on the California coast, where the gray ocean sea absorbs all sounds and thoughts, giving an illusion of peace. Every day I open the laptop and look at that flash drive, not daring to send the files to the police or media, because I know it could lead to new deaths, perhaps Mom's or even my own if they get to me first. But sometimes at night the phone rings with that same number, and I don't pick up. But every time it repeats, I think, maybe it's Dad calling from somewhere. Maybe he didn't really die either and is trying to warn me about something important. Sometimes I go on forums like Reddit to read other people's stories about betrayal, lies, and family dramas, and wonder if I should share my own. But I don't know what to title such a post. Maybe AITA for surviving my own funeral and now not being able to live normally. A year has passed since then, and sometimes it seems to me that this whole story has finally ended and gone into the past. But then I catch myself thinking that a person who once survived their own funeral can no longer be truly alive in the full sense. They just exist between the pages of fake documents, name changes, and nightmare dreams, where they again see a lowering coffin. Only now it's not themselves lying in it, but their empty reflection without a face and soul. I live on the outskirts of Monterey, a small town on the west coast, renting a modest house by the ocean and writing articles for a tourist portal under the pseudonym Alex Berg, pretending to be a freelancer from Canada. And the neighbors know nothing about me except this legend. So sometimes they wave from passing boats, and I smile back, because it's easier to maintain the facade of normality. But at night, sleep doesn't come easily to me because every morning at exactly 3:47, the phone lights up from an incoming call with that same number without a name or voice, only heavy breathing on the other end if I decide to answer. I tried blocking that number, changing SIM cards, and even smashing phones in fits of rage, but the calls still return to new devices, as if someone won't let me forget the past and is watching my every step invisibly. The first time I finally answered the call, there was silence, interrupted only by background sounds like the noise of an elevator, the click of a switch, and a quiet whisper, "It's not all over, James, far from it." After that, I didn't leave the house for 3 days, locking myself inside and fighting paranoia, and then I started drinking to drown out the thoughts and fear. The letter arrived 2 weeks later without a return address, with 2 words on the envelope typed on a typewriter for closure. And inside was a photo of my mother standing in a cemetery by a grave with a plaque, James Winter, 1987-2020. Only the death date was changed to 2023, which made me freeze in shock. Someone knew I was still alive and continuing to exist. Someone updated my grave, especially for me. So I started digging deeper, returning to forums, insurance databases, archives, and chats of former employees of my father's company, where I found out that a few months after the incident, a new firm was registered in California named Renewal Life Solutions Limited, dealing with restructuring insurance assets and liquidating fictitious accounts, with a CEO named Sarah Winter. That was my mother under a new name. I flew to San Francisco on the same route as a year ago, only now with a fake passport in my pocket, and all the time I caught myself feeling strange relief instead of fear, as if I was finally allowing myself to return to that nightmare I left unfinished, to put a period. I found her in the old house on the outskirts where it all began, and she opened the door as if expecting my arrival in advance, aged, with gray hair and the cold gaze of a person who had long erased the boundary between truth and survival at any cost, asking without surprise, "Why did you come here again? It won't change anything." I replied, "You updated the date on my grave. Adding a new one, explain to me what that means." To which she said, "Because the old date no longer matched reality. You died a second time, James, and this time finally in their eyes." I didn't immediately understand her words, but then she placed a fresh newspaper on the table with the headline, "Unknown Man Found Dead in San Francisco Hotel, Suicide Suspected," and in the photo was a face strikingly similar to mine, like a double. I asked, feeling the world becoming shaky under my feet again, "Who is this and why did you do it?" To which she replied, "This is your double, whom we found to convince them of your final death. Otherwise, they would have returned and finished the job themselves." I insisted, "Who are these they you keep talking about?" And she came closer, looking me straight in the eyes, "Those who now control Renewal Life, for whom your father was just a tool in a big game, and now they're using me." She added quietly, almost affectionately, "You need to leave here forever, this time for real and without return." To which I laughed. "I've already died twice according to your documents, Mom. How many more times can we repeat this farce?" She was silent for a long time and then said, "As many as needed until they believe you never really lived at all, erasing all traces of your existence." At night the call came again, but now the voice on the other end was different. Low, even in male, saying, "We know you're with her, don't go home under any pretext." And at that same second the window exploded from a bright flash, showering the room with glass, dust, and fire, making me fall to the floor and grab my mother's hand. She was unconscious with a wound in her side from which blood was flowing, so I pressed my palm to it and shouted, "Mom, do you hear me? Hold on." But when she opened her eyes, she whispered, "James, don't let them finish all this, stop them at any cost." I asked who exactly not to let tell me all the details, but she only exhaled them, those who turned death into a profitable business for themselves and their clients. After which I dragged her out of the burning house into the forest, put her in my father's old car and drove away, but she died 20 minutes later without screams or words, just stopping breathing and staring at the night sky, as if finally finding peace in something bright beyond. I buried her by the ocean without a name on the plaque or a ceremony, and then turned on the laptop and sent all the files, evidence, correspondences, contracts, and a list of resurrected clients, at once to 6 newspaper editorial offices, 3 insurance companies, and 1 embassy to expose the network. A day later, the story came out in the international press under the headline, "Shadows Among the Living," inside the scheme of fake deaths and disappearances in America, causing a scandal and investigations. Since then, I've been constantly on the run under a new passport in the name of Oscar Nelson, without a permanent residence. And sometimes I think that all this truth no longer matters, because no exposures will bring back the dead, and lies are the only thing that keeps some people afloat in this world. But then comes another letter without an address with a photo where I'm standing by my grave, and the plaque is updated to 2025, making me wonder maybe they're right, and I really died back when my father pulled the trigger, and everything that followed is just a prolonged dream from which sometimes I want to wake up, and sometimes not, because awakening will make me realize that this whole world is built on the dead whom no one ever truly buried or mourned.